Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Fintech Nexus webinar. My name is Peter Renton, Chairman and Co-founder of Fintech Nexus, and we have, I would say, the hottest topic in technology this year is clearly generative AI, and we are going to be talking about that today. We're going to dive deeply into how generative AI can apply to risk management, and what does that even mean when we talk about that. So we have a panel of experts here. We're going to, as I said, dive deeply into this topic. You will leave here with a working knowledge of how this all can work and what the potential is, which I think is just fascinating. So with that, let's kick it off. We're going to start with some introductions. Josh, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Peter. Appreciate it. My name is Josh Lin. I'm Senior Vice President of Product. I lead innovation for regulatory compliance here at Socure, really focused on equitable financial inclusion. Been in the space for quite some time and really excited for the discussion today.
Okay, Xin.
Thanks, Josh. My name is Xin Ge. I am currently executive in residence for Matrix Venture. I'm also helping startup, serving as advisors related to risk management. In the past, I've served the executive role in risk management at eBay, PayPal, and Uber. And before this most recent role, I was the Chief Risk Officer and the Chief Technology Officer for Afterpay, who was acquired by Block.
Okay. Saurabh?
Awesome. Thank you, Shin. My name is Saurabh. I am the Chief Product Officer and I lead strategy for Oscillar as well. My experience for the last couple of decades has been in the space of risk management, and my passion lies in bringing together AI, machine learning, and doing good things, which is fighting the good fight. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Okay, so let's kick it off, and maybe we can level set to start the conversation here. You know, we've all witnessed the rise of tools like ChatGPT and Bard and others, and it's been astounding, I think, for everybody to see the capabilities of these tools. So maybe Saurabh, we can start with you, and you can provide sort of a concise definition of generative AI and its applications.
Absolutely. So let me put it this way. Imagine you have a magic crayon that can draw anything you think of, right? If you think of a big friendly dragon, it draws a big friendly dragon. If you think of a house made of candy, it draws a house made of candy, right? So GenAI is like that magic crayon, but instead of drawing with crayons, it uses a computer to make pictures, write stories, or even answer questions. It's like having a super smart friend in the computer who helps you create all sorts of amazing things from your imagination. So I view GenAI as a natural evolution and a very specialized discipline within the broader AI landscape, right? And so while traditional AI has focused largely on understanding and analyzing data, GenAI takes this a step further by generating new content, offering predictive capabilities, and even kind of engaging in creative problem-solving ways. Now, to compare this to traditional machine learning, I would say GenAI is like that super magic crayon. It's even more special because it doesn't just look at the pictures to learn, which is everybody knows this example of you have to look at 1 million cat pictures before you predict something as a cat. Instead, what GenAI does is it listens to stories, it remembers things people say, understands a lot of context in different things and not just pictures or text, right? So when you ask this super magic crayon to draw something, it can create all sorts of amazing new pictures that you might not have even thought of. It's like having a crayon that knows a little bit about everything. And that's why it has kind of gained so much momentum in augmenting us in various tasks. And some of them, Peter, you mentioned like ChatGPT, Bard. There's Midjourney, which focuses a lot on visual content creation. There's a tool called as Jasper, which is an AI tool for generating marketing content for creating blogs. If you haven't seen the influx of blogs coming out, I'm sure a lot of those are coming from these types of tools. There have been chatbots and co-pilots. We have seen a widespread adoption of ChatGPT, but companies are now employing AI-powered chatbots for customer service, using natural language to answer FAQs, assisting in more complex transactional queries, to improve the customer experience and the response times. In fraud detection and prevention, we all know attackers have built tools like Fraud GPT, which is, again, attackers building data, training data to kind of create new types of scams. And so more innovative companies have started to use GenAI for advanced fraud detection, to understand emerging attacks before they become mainstream, in credit scoring and risk assessment, where there have been areas where you can create features for advanced cash flow prediction. So these models have been able to examine like bank statements and alternate data to come up with like more granular way of how do you convert certain types of data into features to improve underwriting offers. There have been a lot of applications in computer vision, because it's not just an OCR who's looking at the image and the text, but it's also reasoning with it. NVIDIA launched an internal project called as Project Nemo to apply LLMs to very complex ways of designing semiconductors. So I think the next decade is going to be all about how companies use GenAI to its advantage to augment, automate, and up-level simple and complex work that otherwise would have required a lot of talent and time.
Right, right, and it's a super exciting time, and we've seen this being called LeapFrog technology. Maybe Josh, I could turn to you and just maybe describe exactly what that means and what are the distinct advantages it offers.
Yeah, I think that's such an apt term, right? LeapFrog technology. It's it's a term that's really used to be able to describe when you make huge leaps and bounds. Some might even call it quantum leaps around these capabilities. But specifically for GenAI, there's huge leaps and bounds that are being made across vision and language and reasoning, robotics, you name it. Some might call it a context window. Some might say it's something else. But really, I think that the magic that GenAI has is actually the ability to be able to learn how to learn. I think that it allows for so much more nuanced understanding about human behavior, specifically identities. And GenAI allows us to be able to surface all of the complexities that sort of live within us, analyzing that contextual and contextual information in more of like a common sense way, instead of just rigid rules. Even when it comes to like entity resolution, instead of just blocking techniques, it can help you understand the nuances and the similarities and patterns between different identities as well. And sometimes I think GenAI actually does a better job at doing this than we think that we can, understanding our own nuances, being able to make those connections across texts, across graphs, images and biometrics, really providing that, what everyone's sort of been converging on over the last several years is that 360-degree view of an individual as they interact online. I think most importantly for us, it's really about synthesizing historical patterns and emerging threats, and being able to do that in real time. And I think that is an incredible perspective that warrants a ton of respect for it. But along with that breadth and along with that precision, I think that it leads to a profound amount of advantages in higher accuracy and lower false positives. And for me, it actually leads to better explainability too. I can use a prompt to be able to say specifically, if I were a expert fraud analyst or if I were a BSA analyst, how might I interpret this or how might I change my behavior? And that's very different from saying, do I think that this identity is good or bad, right? Having that context or that persona-based explanation can really go a long way. I think that there's a ton of beauty also in just being able to create that narrative around that connective tissue between identities, devices, and accounts, being able to really see that whole picture. It's just really, really incredible. But probably the thing actually that most excites me about all of this is just having transparency and fairness and ethics really built into it. I think those are all key components that we all strive to be able to build into our machine learning models. But historically, it's been done after the fact, right? Do we actually have disparate decisions that are being made within our models? And you evaluate it after the fact. Here, putting it into an actual construct prior to the build and during the build of the models themselves is a huge leap forward that I'm super, super excited about.
Right. So let's dig into sort of the fraudsters and their increasing sophistication, because they have all the tools as well. They've been using ML tools for a while, and I'm curious about why generative AI is becoming crucial now. What is kind of special about now?
Yeah, Josh, I'm happy to take that one. I think you asked the real good question, why now, right? So as a former chief risk officer, I feel the timing of making the company willing to make investment in risk management is either yesterday or tomorrow, right? So like either too late or we can wait. So it's really important to make the investment now. And as you mentioned, the sophistication of fraudster has really gotten like evolved with the technology. I think the online fraud didn't even exist about 2 decades ago. At that time, the most sophisticated fraud schemes were fake checks, right? So as we see the internet grows, we fraudsters unfortunately are usually leading us in terms of adopting new technology. We saw people early days start using proxy to hide their presence, right? So it's a matter of who adopts, and then the other side adapt to it very, very quickly. I think that what's unique about the generative AI, there's a couple of things. One is um, the the speed of innovation is much, much faster than before, right? In the past, it takes uh, fraudsters or us multiple iteration to get to the right answer, and the time of improvement of product takes time. But nowadays, with generative AI, we've already seen a product, GPT type product for fraudsters in the dark market, and the way they train and improve projects, their product is a matter of hours, can get more sophisticated and more precise on their attacks. So that makes more dangerous for us if we're not taking any actions right now. And I think the existing product we have in hand are lacking. I think the investment in modeling machine learning has been pretty significant. However, the downside is still there's a lot of black box solutions. Just the algorithm itself sometimes lacks context. Oftentimes, attack things happen not because algorithm, but because product policy holds. So generative AI actually gives a more complete view of the world. So that's why I think it's crucial now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think one thing to add there is also it's helping bridging the talent gap. So for a long time, we've talked about the traditional ML models and how every company needs a data scientist and a group of data scientists to like really build those machine learning models. But I mean, there's a clear talent gap in terms of data scientists and data engineers who can really build more sophisticated models, deploy these sophisticated models. So there's a notable shortage of cybersecurity and risk and engineering experts in this space. So GenAI is also kind of bridging the gap by helping like perform tasks that were otherwise require like a lot of human expertise, right? So my team, for example, my data scientists have been using tools within ChatGPT as well, but outside in our GenAI platform as well to do data analysis, visualization, interpreting complex model behaviors, right? So all the tasks that data scientists would take like days to do now can be compressed in a couple of hours to do those kind of data understanding, fraud understanding. And similarly, like the subject matter experts who possess the domain knowledge, they would be dependent on the data science and engineering teams to do small analysis and queries. And they would say, hey, maybe can you look at these 30 records? And if there's some kind of a correlation and write an SQL query, now the analyst can go and basically do some of these themselves and not rely on the data science and engineering teams for everything. So it does democratize the ability to kind of do more complex actions by a wide variety of people now.
Interesting. Yeah, it's really good points there. So, Josh, I want to turn back to you. You touched on it earlier, but I want to dig into identity verification and the applications for generative AI. Could you provide some insights into what you're currently using, or how you're currently using generative AI, and maybe and what future plans you might have?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I mean, the biggest thing, right, is that just like Jen and Saurabh have pointed out, is that the ability for GenAI to be able to democratize tools has increased substantially, right? So you talk about fraud GPT, and the fraudsters using that to be able to develop new attack patterns. We're also using the same to be able to see if we can hack our own systems and then improve those over time as well. And I think that we're really just scratching the surface. I think that some of the most exciting ways that we've been using it here at Socure are being able to automatically surface related entities and patterns, and really exciting and incredible visualizations to be able to see those connections that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to spot ourselves. being able to explain the connections like between the different identities and the different patterns that take a really, really long time to be able to surface are starting to come about as well. I think some of the future applications are pretty incredible as well. Just imagine us being able to continuously analyze raw data to be able to create new explanatory features with our models on our own, or being able to leverage unsupervised models to be able to categorize messy and unstructured data into new clusters, and being able to use that in active learning ways. And so I'm just super excited about the path that we've already taken so far and the promise that it has in the future, and continue to continue developing and building and making an impact here. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you have a question for our group of experts here, hit the Q&A button. We're already getting some questions coming in here. We'll leave some time at the end for those. Although there's one that in our next question here, there's a question that comes in that's sort of related to it, but maybe could someone elaborate on, maybe Saurabh, it'd be great if you could do this, on the specific scenarios where generative AI has a clear edge over traditional machine learning models. What are the inherent challenges? What's the ROI? And perhaps maybe you could give us some real world examples.
At least for me on my side, like historical machine learning problems that we've used or that we've tried to solve in the past really takes a massive amount of data, and it takes a really long time trying to cleanse that data to be able to get it into a format that is going to improve the models. And now with GenAI, we can rapidly expand that training data by acquiring users of high value, for example. And I think that the ontology and being able to identify patterns and then actually apply those towards future transactions allows us to be able to generate new training data that allows us to be able to learn a lot faster and iterate on our models in a much faster way as well.
So I'll try to answer this in the context of Oscillor, which is an AI risk decisioning platform for fraud risk, compliance risk, and credit risk. We have seen various scenarios where GenAI has a clear edge over traditional models. And I would say we are just scratching the surface right now. And let me kind of explain those 3 areas where we have kind of found it a lot more valuable in terms of how it has a clear edge and how we are kind of showing some of the ROI related to those use cases as well. So the first one is in improving the effectiveness of current predictive machine learning models. So a lot of companies, a lot of data scientists, a lot of tools use supervised machine learning algorithms. They are some kind of a tree-based algorithm, either an XGBoost or a light GBM. And so what can you do with GenAI to improve the effectiveness of these models for fraud detection, right? So that's kind of the first way. So what we do is, so one thing that is really often overlooked in this space is that complex forms of fraud, scams, social engineering attacks, deep fakes, right? They require analyzing a very high dimensional data, right? And traditional ML models have limited capability to use highly dimensional data as features of the model. Usually they're looking at frequency, velocity patterns of transactions and events, right? How many times have I seen Saurabh in the last 30 days on this device? Those are things that traditional ML models have been able to use as behaviors, as features in the models. But generative AI models, such as transformers, are uniquely capable of capturing very complex dependencies and relationships in a very high dimensional data plane, right? So understanding the context of the transactions, which is kind of what traditional ML does, but also the history of the accounts involved and the network of interactions between the different accounts. How do you kind of look at the entire space of that complexity and convert those into features that can feed into an existing predictive ML model, right? In making the current models more powerful. That's kind of the lowest hanging fruit. And so an example where we use today is transformers to feed complex features into an XGBoost model to improve the efficacy of a Zelle fraud detection or a scam detection, because that is where these complex features cannot be created by humans because it's very hard to visualize the entire space of features, right? In that same space, we use GenAI models to simulate different scenarios and proactively train machine learning models using that training data for improved performance. For example, in the traditional world, you would have a rule. For example, if someone has accessed an account more than 4 times and changed the password all those 3 or 4 times, block that account, right? Those are simple rule scenarios. So you can figure out for these rule scenarios what should be the right thresholds dynamically, because static rules can be broken, right? And so GenAI is able to kind of really figure out boundary conditions and simulate those boundary conditions and figure out before the attacker does on how to defeat those boundary conditions, right? It is able to create new attack vector simulations. For example, subtle variations in data, it can simulate that and say, okay, how would your current model behave on this? And so it is able to model that and see if it can beat the current model, which is kind of what Josh was talking about, the concept of red teams attacking your own models and figuring out the simulations where your current models get defeated and how to kind of create features for those. So that's the first area. Now, the second area where generative AI models are very useful are in detecting complex fraud types as a whole, right? Where labeled training data is sparse. So think of like account takeover attacks or first-party fraud, where it's all about understanding the intent. There's not a lot of labels in many scenarios. And so we use GANs, which is basically a generative adversarial network algorithm for account takeover protection. Because usually the sparse label means these types of model perform better than other unsupervised techniques like isolation forest. So in GANs, you have 2 neural networks that make up the GAN. One is a generator, one is a discriminator. And what the generator is doing is it's creating realistic user behavior data, including login patterns, transaction histories, right? And what the discriminator is doing is it's identifying which of those output it receives has been artificially created, right? So they're kind of going against each other. One is creating the scenarios, the other is trying to figure out the anomalies in the scenario. So GANs are very adept at anomaly detection, and they help improve problems like ATOs or first-party fraud, where the labels are sparse and the intent is hard to understand, right? The third area I would say is co-pilots. Co-pilots are being seen in many places to augment the workforce, the subject matter experts, but they really help in increasing the speed and efficiency of fraud operations team, right? From what we have observed, it's kind of creating a 10x type of an impact. So we are developing a range of co-pilots, for example, at Osler, to augment risk teams and operations to do things like root cause analysis, right? A root cause analysis co-pilot could basically allow analysts and data scientists to understand new fraud patterns immediately. So usually you have to look at multiple dashboard, Excel, write SQL queries to analyze information. And now you can just ask the co-pilot why a certain thing was fraud, or you could use it to do rule writing. So instead of having the human figure out the rule of, if you've seen this device on this account by accessed by more than 3 different users, then block this, it can come up with these rule suggestions automatically by looking at the thresholds as well. And then other places kind of really automating reporting. So you have all these AML narratives that need to be generated or threat briefings. It can do a very good job in summarizing structured data also, and creating narratives in a structured way that allows for streamlining the reporting and operations, which usually we end up spending a lot of weeks generating reports and threat briefings, either for the exec presentations or fraud analysis. So those are 3 concrete areas where we have seen a significant impact of applying GenAI along with traditional ML models, and where GenAI tends to kind of beat traditional ML models in some spaces.
Right. Well, that all sounds fantastic, but I want to talk about the other side of things here, and that is, what are the challenges? What are the hesitations that the people that have with this new technology? Maybe there's there's some concerns that a company might have before rolling this out. Maybe Josh, can you touch on that to start?
Yeah, I mean, some of the biggest concerns I think are the use of the data. Like if you're using off the shelf, technologies, who actually owns that data? Where is it going? There's other concerns around, possible hallucinations. Like, is it actually going to make the decision in the right way, or does it still need some overlay of human supervision? And then, probably third, just, is it making the right recommendations in the right places? you might ask it like a general question to be able to generate different patterns or extract certain features, and not immediately knowing what the impact is going to be. And so I think, especially being so nascent and so early in the development of these technologies, we're going to see at least on the early onset, we're going to see a heavy reliance on human supervision to be able to make sure that that the right recommendations are getting made, and then put more trust in the systems over time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Shin, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Josh already mentioned a lot of good points. I guess from a being practical point of view, this generative AI, I think, is still very, very new. So lots going to change. I do think it's a very, very significant investment for the company. So I often caution the company also, like in terms of making the foundational investment for the risk management platform infrastructure versus things are more cutting edge, and it's not every company has the right amount of investment and resources they can pursue this. So I think partner with someone who's doing this oftentimes it would be a good choice, especially for smaller companies. I think the Gen AI is also very fast and efficient. So it's going to work really, really well, whether it's in the operation space or building policies. In theory, it should be easy, but like I just want to make sure if we adopt that, make sure the human feedback, the manual feedback is still there. The power of just coming from the updated information. So the feedback loop is really important.
Yeah, Peter, and I can maybe add a little bit to this. So
Yep.
we recently launched our GenAI capabilities for risk management. The 3 points that I was talking about previously kind of were derived from how we are applying things. We have talked to over 30 risk experts and leaders to really understand what are their concerns, right? What are their hesitations? How would they think of bringing in this technology into their company? A couple of concerns that we hear about is, of course, like, how do we know that this is working, right? And this is kind of a playbook that I'm creating right now for people who have started using our technology. Is you have to first really define the KPIs for these types of models as well. And there are some traditional KPIs which still are applicable, which is how do you look at false positive rate, false negative rate? How do you look at precision recall? How do you look at F1 score? To really understand whether you're measuring the KPIs by adding these types of features to your current model or in your anomaly detection model. That's kind of number one area. The number two concern that has been like, how do you validate and test that this is actually working, right? And a lot of this is to do with, I would say, the traditional ways of having a holdout validation, cross-validation are great things, but we do a lot of like A/B testing as well, right? So if you can show A/B testing by deploying these types of capabilities and techniques in shadow mode in a very controlled environment to compare its like performance against existing systems, that's another way to get confidence that these models are doing what they're intended to do, right? And so that basically allows more confidence in being able to deploy these types of models, along with just following the SR11 and other kind of model governance report, which kind of explain how these models work, etc. Right? And I think Shin made a great point about human in the feedback loop, which is you need the human to be able to look at the outcomes of the models and be able to understand, are they making sense? Are they explainable? And that's kind of a lot of research is going into interpretability and explainability as a whole in AI, but just regarding the Gen AI models as well. So traditionally, we've been using sharp and line type of algorithms to improve explainability of our models. But as basically we have these Gen AI models, we want to make sure that traceability of the decisions is core. You can go back to looking at the data that was used to explain these models or make decisions out of these models.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about refining risk systems. And Shin, maybe we can talk to you about this, because risk operators often grapple with the challenge of refining risk systems, and risk teams often find themselves inundated with alerts and cases, often missing the broader customer perspective. So how does generative AI address these challenges, enabling risk teams to devise more effective strategies and manage risk operations more efficiently?
Yeah, I think again, this is still early stage, so there's a lot of new things coming, and I've been thinking, what are the areas like generative AI can really help the organization. Again, like machine learning has been existing for a long period of time. It does a fairly good job in terms of predicting which transaction is fraud and which customer is good. But we always need to add another layer in the company related to machine learning model. That's what we call strategy, because there are different treatments, different considerations, the business contact need to be added to the machine learning. For example, in different countries, you might want to take different action. For different group of customers, VIP customer, you obviously don't want to do any false negatives there, false positive there. So I think there are two areas I think will be really, really helpful to use generative AI in terms of generating content. One is for really early stage company, when they start putting the first kind of a risk management system in place, in addition to machine learning algorithm, added the context of business, how they want to treat different segments of customers, what different treatments they want to put in place to put together a holistic strategy. I think that's an area that you can generate content using generative AI. So that's one area. The second area is where I think we all have risk management system in place and we think it should be working, but it doesn't always work. So sometimes a fraud spike happens, a big case going through, and you wonder why. And that takes the process of doing postmortem and identify what is the issue, how thorough, how quickly you can get to that determines how quickly you can put in a solution in place. And that's could be a very quick fix, or it could be a long process, because it's not always the algorithm. It could be the data gap, it could be a system loophole, it could be a bug, it could be a new feature we introduce, it could be a gap between the risk management strategy and risk operation implementation. So having a way to automatically generate a post-mortem report that covers all aspects of product, policy, operation, analytics, and data, I think that could be very powerful organization. So I'm sure there are other use cases there as well, but those are the two I can think of: setting up the initial strategy and also doing postmortem.
Okay, so we're going to get to audience questions in just a little bit. So if you have a question for our experts here, hit the Q&A button. Before we do that, though, Saurabh, I want to turn to you. And in this new era of generative AI, how should companies recalibrate their approach when evaluating next gen risk 3.0 vendors? I mean, what criteria or considerations should be top of mind?
Absolutely. So Shin talked about why now, if you remember earlier, and he talked about the evolution of the attacker ecosystem. So if I had to define that ecosystem and summarize what Shin said, the attacker ecosystem is a lot more organized. You have attackers who are using Discord channels and Telegram to kind of really organize works. They're creating training material to train other attackers. You can buy these training materials for $200, get trained on using basic bot attacks, using fraud GPT-like tools to generate data. And so there's a lot of like, how do you create AI-powered attacks? There's a lot of like training around those. And so Shin mentioned how the attacks used to be more check fraud type of attacks. But if you see the last 10 years, the attacks have been the same, but they've become more sharper, more precise, bigger in volume. And so not only you have sophistication in terms of it's hard to detect a phishing email now because you can use Fraud GPT or even other kind of tools to generate highly good content, which doesn't have spelling mistakes and stuff. But you also have bots that could be engineered to mimic device and behavioral biometrics to look like a good user. So in this new world where the attacker ecosystem has kind of become so mature, so organized, and so sharp, how do you look at the risk 3.0 tools? That's kind of what we're trying to answer. And so the risk 3.0 technologies also need to keep up with this kind of an attack evolution, and using generative AI along with traditional ML models and data techniques will become a prominent thing in this decade, right? So I would say the decade of 2023 and beyond is all about how do companies start doing things now, which is kind of what Shin was saying. It's either yesterday or tomorrow, and so we need to start doing things now. So there are 6 things I would recommend in terms of how you evaluate certain types of technologies in being able to choose the risk 3.0 platform, right? So first, they need to have a very balanced approach and a very layered approach. They need to have the ability to have dynamic rules, not static rules, dynamic rules that you are able to understand how they are able to change when pattern changes, right? We still need rules, but they need to be very dynamic, not static. Second, the system needs to have the ability to use traditional ML models like GBM, XGBoost, because to stop repeat attacks, the models need to learn on vast amounts of data, and traditional ML models are important to kind of stop repeat behaviors, repeat attacks. And then third, which is kind of what we are talking about, GenAI, which is super useful for simulating new attack vectors or understanding new attack vectors even before they happen. You don't have to wait for labels for like 2 months, 3 months to come in to say, okay, now how do I figure out how to stop these attacks? So GenAI techniques will help you in creating new features, generating better labels, simulating attacks, finding those anomalies in new attack vectors much better than rules or models will, right? So that's one category to have a very layered approach in terms of your detection techniques. Second, a lot of solutions out there are no-code solutions, or they are pre-canned one API that can do everything. And that is not enough, because we went from like code to no code and went from like this extreme flexibility to a very rigid schema. And the risk 3.0 solutions need to use more of a natural language to orchestrate strategies, whether it's your rules, models, GenAI capabilities, but also have a foundational schema that allows them to evolve very easily to the nth degree, so that it's not like, this is the data you're going to use to attack a very complex attack vector. You need to be able to evolve that schema much more easily, right? The third is, how can these tools help you democratize the power of data? Today, this data sits in either databases, or it sits behind a Tableau dashboard or some kind of a proprietary dashboard. And so by using GenAI, it helps in creating a natural language interface to be able to interact with this data. And so not only a data scientist or engineer, but a fraud expert or a practitioner or even executive can basically ask questions to this data and understand what was the fraud rate in the last 30 days and how is it different from the time before, or what were the top reasons of fraud. And so you really need to be able to understand how to democratize this data, and the risk 3.0 tools should be able to give you this natural language interface to be able to do so. Number 4, I would say, is super important, because as you know, generative AI is all about creating knowledge, understanding knowledge. So creating that knowledge base becomes super important. Current systems, they would either store features or store information just as raw data, but the knowledge base functions as a dynamic repository of data and insights. So it's continuously kind of updating its knowledge base with new transaction data, behavior patterns, entity profiles, risk assessments, and reputations. And that's kind of very critical in playing a role of how do you craft these new types of rules, models, and AI kind of context that allows you to create these better strategies. So knowledge becomes important. So think of it as raw data, processes knowledge, and then how GenAI rules and models kind of work on top of it to create efficient strategies. The fifth one I would say is looking at some kind of a data-driven case management. We know fraud operations team live and die by the case management tools. And so you almost want to think of what is that Sherlock Holmes kind of an experience. So instead of like you sifting through data manually in multiple interfaces and CRM tools, there is a GenAI Copilot, which is basically helping you understand how to get that data, analyze that data, create narratives out of that data. That would basically streamline a lot of your risk operations, right? Reducing the cost, but also your analyst can do 10 times more work with 10 times less effort. And the last I would say is the most important, which is assurance, right? Now, whether that's about having the ability in the platform, in the 3.0 technologies, to be able to test the models, trace the models, do audit, do governance, and be able to explain these things, right? So if you are just sprinkling generative AI in your risk platform as a co-pilot for example, a document answer kind of a Q&A, it doesn't work, right? You have to be able to understand how do you use testing, tracing, governance, explainability to explain the decisions out of these models and be able to reason as well. And that should be demonstrated by the platform as well. So these, I would say, are the top 6 things I would say on how you think of the key pillars of a platform that you choose for Risk 3.0.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very thorough. So let's move now into audience questions here. The first one, how is generative AI? Let me start over. How generative AI is already created or creating impact in credit risk management? Can you please share practical examples? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that one maybe. I think one of the most practical examples for using AI or generative AI specifically in credit risk models is feature extraction. So being able to find the hidden patterns within the data that humans wouldn't be able to spot, and that allows us to be able to make better recommendations, either from a treatment perspective on that particular transaction, or if you think about it from a growth perspective, you're actually able to make recommendations about tweaking a specific product or a specific feature to that customer's unique risk profile. And so really being able to create personalized financial experiences for our customers. I think that in this way, like generative AI is really acting like a super smart assistant, constantly trying to study the customer behavior and transactions to be able to identify opportunities and suggest tweaks that really best align with each person's risk posture, because not one size really fits all. And then the other thing is just like finding those different nuances and then being able to create features. I think we talked a little bit about this before, but one of the ways that Socare is using generative AI is being able to predict the next character within a given email pattern, for example, and determining whether a email actually makes sense, whether it's likely that someone had typed this out, or whether it's just gibberish. So after I type in, JOS, in my personal email, is it likely that I would type in a Z or likely type in a V or an H, for example? Generative AI allows us to be able to create these perplexity scores to be able to determine whether it is, coherent or not, or whether it's just fictitiously being made up to be able to fabricate or manipulate an identity.
And I can give some examples on the underwriting use case, especially in credit risk management. So if you have all seen your bank statements, you know how cryptic those codes can be, right? You have a merchant where you're buying something, you have a time, date, etc. And if you look at different banks and their bank statements, for example, a JPMC versus a Wells Fargo versus some other bank, they don't all follow same kind of categorization models as well, right? So each of these are very cryptic. And so one of the applications that we've been seeing in underwriting is how do you do bank transaction categorization using these bank statements. And these are kind of non-falsifiable information. So you could create a transformer model to categorize these transactions to understand, okay, I've looked at all these transactions. I know these are gas-related transactions, or these are electronic purchases-related transactions. This is the merchant, and that merchant is consistent across all different types of transactions. And so this categorization helps a lot in being able to look at this unstructured data and bank statements and being able to create a profile of income and expenses that can be basically used to recreate a financial health model for that consumer or for that business, right? And that basically is one of the applications on how can you improve your underwriting models using some of the bank statement data or even alternate data, right? Second, we have also seen a lot of places where people have been using it for fraud detection. We talked about some of the fraud use cases in payments, but you could also look at it from a perspective of credit applications such as identity theft or false information and first-party fraud kind of things. And I would say there's like a third one that we've started to see a lot, which is since GenAI is very good with scenario generation. So a lot of people are using it for like stress testing and scenario analysis with our tools, right? So you could have GenAI models that are used to stress test and simulate various economic conditions to assess their impacts on credit portfolios. Early usage, but this kind of really goes into that strength of simulation and figuring out where the model would break and what would be the impact of the model, doing a lot of like what if analysis, scenario analysis, etc. as well.
Okay. Next question here. What words of advice do you have for someone starting to use generative AI in the fraud context?
I can take that. And Josh, maybe if you want to kind of add on with your experience at Soccer, that would be awesome.
Yeah, sure.
I would say there's a somewhat widely held viewpoint about model governance being a key reason why it's holding back people from using GenAI for fraud detection or risk management, because either these models are not explainable or there's no governance techniques. So my advice here would be to explore ways to leverage the strengths that we talked about of generative AI to complement existing models which are more governed, which basically things like how do you create features automatically, how do you encode complex variables automatically to feed into these supervised machine learning models. That's a low-hanging fruit. It's about automatically generating these features into current models. That doesn't require a lot of effort from a perspective of explaining and governance. The second area I would say is leveraging the natural language-based co-pilots for various tasks that make the risk operations team more productive. Again, there are a lot of co-pilots out there in different spaces outside of fraud and risk, more in terms of how do you create content and do things. But you could basically leverage these co-pilots to explain the data, do insights, analytics. There's not a lot of model governance here because you're just trying to accelerate the process of fraud understanding or data understanding or trend analysis, right? And that also is something where you can start using a lot of these techniques. And then, of course, I think attack simulations is an amazing thing we have found super useful in how do you kind of create these attack simulations for proactive retraining of models rather than waiting for labels. For example, a chargeback label can come within like 30 to 60 days, right? Do you really want to wait for 60 days till the attacker changes its MO? And so you want to be able to kind of really understand how do you simulate these attack vectors much more in advance using some of the GenAI's strengths. So again, we will need to leverage GenAI at a deeper level. Of course, this is, I still believe we're scratching the surface on it. The future is to kind of really use GenAI to fight GenAI. So that's where I would say a lot of advancements would be made in the coming years.
And I think you framed it up really well, actually. You know, when we look at model governance from an FI perspective, SR 11.7 does complicate things a little bit in the sense that it does need to have explainability, and sometimes that explainability, especially when it's Gen AI, it's not going to be consistent from time to time, and it may not be apparent. Oftentimes it's intuitive, but it may not be, you know, very explainable right off the bat. And so this kind of goes back to my earlier point about using it to be able to extract features first. Then you can determine what the impact of those features are and whether you want to include them in the model, and then whether you want to you know, actually leverage them within decisions or not. And then the second piece, which you really touched on, where I see so much opportunity, is around you know, process efficiency, being able to analyze a large set of transactions, find out what the anomalies are, find out common patterns, and then be able to improve decision making over time. So using it as a building block first until we can get to a point where
Josh froze.
I think we Josh is just frozen on us. So let's move on to the next question, shall we? I think he was wrapping up. Generative AI models can hallucinate. Doesn't that introduce false positives or negatives in fraud detection?
That's an interesting one. So if you've followed GenAI, of course, you would have also followed this term hallucination, which is GenAI models have the ability to make up things, because that's what they do. They create things. So they can really make up things when the factual data is not there. And that's kind of the hallucination that a lot of people have heard about in the space of GenAI. Now, in the context of fraud and financial crime detection, there are ways that we have figured out on how to handle these kind of hallucinations or have long-term memory so that the models don't forget on the past behaviors, right? Because they're learning a lot of context. It's like taking an entire library and learning of it. So every new book that you add, you need to make sure that you're condensing the memory and maintaining the memory of what you have learned as well. So there's a concept called as RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. What it does, it fetches relevant information from existing data sources and generate responses. So it reduces the likelihood of hallucinations by relying on more factual, validated information. And this is kind of why I was talking about the knowledge base becomes so much more important with GenAI as well, because you need to make sure that it can rely on factual data sources and policies that you have maintained, right? So RAG is one technique. The other one is tuning and fine-tuning. Again, continuously fine-tuning the GenAI model, adjusting its parameters based on feedback and any observed hallucination patterns. They can help. The model becomes more accurate and less prone to generating false information. So there are a lot of other things that people have been doing with prompt engineering or prompt chaining or function calling, and then fine-tuning, right? This is usually the process people handle to fine-tune the models. This shows the ability to kind of really remove those kind of false positive negatives in decisions. And then I think you need to really establish some KPIs around your LLMs, large language models, because establishing these clear KPIs help you evaluate the performance of the fraud detection. And these KPIs should include metrics like hallucination rates, false positives, false negatives. I talked a couple of these in the past, but also when you've put a model in production, what is the data drift, model drift, and how do you kind of monitor these things? And again, the last thing I would say is traceability everywhere, because if you have used the data to generate a tax simulation or a decision, you need to be able to click on it to understand what was the data used and be able to trace every input, every outcome, every decision related to that answer, so that you can show from a model governance perspective as well how you're doing things. So those, I would say, are kind of ways to make sure you can you're not hallucinating, and providing a lot more structure in the ability to use GenAI for fraud detection.
Anyone else got anything to add to that? Okay, let's move on to one more question. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I think it's good to ask anyway, so we can delve into it. GenAI models will need to go through extensive model governance, which itself will take more than a year. So aren't we far from benefiting from GenAI for fraud detection?
Josh, maybe you're talking about SR11. Maybe if you want to touch on it a bit, I can expand as well, but I think it'd be good for you to.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the complexity of the GenAI models, I definitely see, I mean, maybe not a year, but some extensive time frame that's needed to be able to put a true GenAI model through that. When we talk about, stress testing and sensitivity analysis, the likelihood of hallucination, and then the performance metrics, I think we're a ways away from using GenAI models in production from a true credit perspective. I think, the immediate focus is being able to extract some of those features and then use those features within models in a more controlled environment. But I don't think that we're actually that far off. Look how far we've come in this short period of time. When we talked earlier in the discussion around, leapfrogging technology, I think there's going to be some really exciting leapfrogging technology that's going to come about from a model governance perspective as well as you're building it.
Yeah, there's a lot of investment that has gone into GenAI in the last 2 years, as you see the evolution of the technology, and there's a lot of other startups that have come in to show how model governance, explainability of LLMs can be done. And so while that is happening, I think you can already begin benefiting from GenAI for fraud detection by implementing, like Josh said, right? How do you come up with new features for your current models? And I would say the second place is also copilots, right? Copilots are mostly assisting and augmenting to get data, explain data, reason data, and those don't require extensive model governance at all. So while SR11 and those kind of reports figure out how some of these capabilities need to be proven out, you still have the ability to use them in Copilot mode or be able to augment your current features.
Yeah, just to add, I think depends on the size of a company and which industry you are. I think the requirement of model governance is very, very different. But in general, I think the requirement on fraud space is not as regulated and high than the credit space. So I would expect probably a earlier adoption in the fraud space. A lot of transactions happen and the trend changes a lot. So the fact is like whatever the model works best to catch a fraud, actually through control test is going to win. I think in the credit space, this is where like, I don't know, like you can tell the model to be more explainable. I think those are the things that can maybe easier to tweak to get to the right balance between precision and explainability.
I think the last point I'll leave here with is you don't expect the fraudsters to go through model governance when they're fighting fraud. And so I think we should keep that in mind, which is we are not in the process of model governance for the heck of model governance. We're in the process of fighting the bad guys in the fraud use cases. And so whatever, as Chin mentioned, if the GenAI models do better, then yes, the KPIs will be very clear in proving that out.
That's right. Lead with the technology first, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Really appreciate your insight. I learned so much in the last hour, so thank you very much for that. Josh, Shin, Saurabh, really appreciate your insights. Thank you to Ocelar for sponsoring this session. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, for tuning in. Very much appreciate your attention. And with that, I wish you all a very good afternoon. Thanks, everybody. See ya.